at all. But the institution of slavery helped perpetuate something that, while it existed in the North, the idea of white supremacy was not nearly as deeply ingrained in the psychology of the North as it was in the South. So if you understand, while many Northerners were not abolitionists, they weren't necessarily pro-slavery defenders. But I usually argue with just about anybody who will listen, it would have probably been real hard to find any white people in America, short of maybe the Quakers, who weren't racist. You understand? Because that was the prevailing science of the time, the prevailing mindset of the time, the prevailing religious teaching of the time. So difficulty, but keep in mind, the institution, the idea of slavery was from the very beginning perceived to be something not reflective of the values of our country that we've created, with the ideas of the Declaration of Independence, most notably, the idea of the Bill of Rights. So I try to point out that our earliest sort of advocates of how to end slavery believed, one, that it would die a natural death. In other words, like slavery was just on the way out. It was expensive. It wouldn't really work, like it says here. And of course, they also thought it was evil. I will remind you later on, both Jefferson and Madison are going to be criticized by Southerners as being foolish. You understand? So there are nuances on white slavery attitudes. Not to justify. I never play that role. It's not my job to say they were right. That's what they believe. Okay. And I gave you a bunch of founders who had said slavery was immoral. So remember that. But keep in mind that the thing that fundamentally changes this, and I think most people know this, is this invention. So it's this change that's almost singular. Like rarely can you ever point at one moment. You could say the Enabling Act in 1933 made Hitler possible. Perhaps. But very rarely can you say this fundamentally changed the whole nature of what an institution is. And so with the cotton gin, I'm not saying Americans weren't already racist, but we weren't making a large-scale defense of slavery prior to this thing. You didn't see, but now, who's going to be invested in this? Who's going to be a part of this? Well, it's not just Southerners anymore. Before, the North weren't tobacco manufacturers, right? The North, yeah, they could eat rice or dye their clothes perhaps with indigo, but there was not a lot of connectivity between slavery in the North and slavery in the South, with the exception that Northerners often engaged in these slave merchant trade. So, for example, Connecticut and New England would go over and buy slaves. So there was elements of that, Rhode Island, but not on the large scale. Now, all those textiles back in chapter 14, remember that chapter? All those inventions are dependent on this labor supply. And so for most of them, it's out of sight, out of mind. They're just happy to be able to be employed. Just like in America today, we don't really care where the stuff we wear comes from. Right? You guys really doing a lot of back study on the origin of your sweatshirt? Right? Now, there are some students in America, believe this or not, on campuses that oppose sweatshop labor. So they demand that like Duke University, for example, insists, that the student body does, that at least at the college, at the campus, that they do not sell anything that sweatshop labor produced. The students say Duke won't be a part of that. So that's interesting. They have a moral conscience that goes with consumption. And a lot of times in America, we don't really do that. So that's going to be part of what emerges in the abolition issue. Okay? So anyway, we talked about how slavery evolved because of this cotton kingdom, right? Particularly the long-term impact means the South is utterly dependent on a single cash, the Deep South, right? And how is the Upper South connected to this as far as dependency? It's going to be the major industry, if you want to call it that, of Virginia and Tennessee and Kentucky. Coal. Sorry, yes, be loud. Coal. No, not coal. Not in this period. It will be later, but they don't even know they have coal in Kentucky, hardly. They haven't started the mining industry on a large scale. It's some, but not on a large scale. Yeah, if you go back to the iron ore was discovered here. See that? But yeah, they're not really coal mining much yet. Not on a large scale. They will, certainly by the 1800s, mid-1800s, they'll start to see that. No, breeding slaves. Selling slaves down the river. Now, the ordinary yeoman farmer isn't doing that. He's what? What's a yeoman farmer do for a living? They subsistence farm. You guys know that phrase, subsistence? They're barely growing enough, and that's how it's been since the 1600s. All right, so that part doesn't change. All right, but for the wealthy planters now selling their slaves down the river. So we talked about that in the first section, was who the structure of the white society was, the sort of southern planter. Keep in mind, ordinary working class white people, yeoman farmers, didn't buy into all this stuff. It wasn't viable. It didn't make sense to them. They didn't live in a house that looked like that. They didn't read Walter Scott. They didn't study Knights in history. They're like, keep in mind, I tried to show you guys Maslow's hierarchy of needs the other day. You guys remember that? For your ordinary, like, working class, lower income, struggling to survive person, they're not sitting around making, existential definitions of themselves as honorable knights, things like that, right? They're just trying to make ends meet. Got it? And so again, I would emphasize that the bulk of your Southern whites don't own slaves. Many poor whites are resentful of slavery, but despise blacks. Understand? They don't like slavery because it means they can't get a job. They can't own land. They can't be successful because they can't compete with labor that doesn't get paid. But they despise the race of people who make up the slavery. Okay? And so that's an interesting element. So definitely remember that. And we talked about how very much a part of this culture. Okay? So yesterday we were looking at elements of what slavery was like, particularly for the African American. Okay? So the free Southern blacks, small percentage. We talked about the long-term legacy, both in things like names. And again, if you are ever interested in going into a field of history that is sort of almost uncharted, there is a emerging field of ethno studies in who the people are that were slaves and how their history evolved, like where they came from. There's a lot of ethnic studies in terms of like genetics, DNA tests, because like I said, last names, that doesn't give you much help, past four or five generations. Okay? This is one of the things I consider most disgusting, most repulsive about it, repugnant about it. This kind of distorted American dream of breeding slaves like cattle. Okay? And then we talked about value, right? The thing that really makes it easy to remember why most white people in the South didn't own slaves is that slaves were extraordinarily expensive as people. All right? It was a major purchase. So when we talk about brutality to slaves, it absolutely happened. People were physically brutal. But at the same time, the last thing you don't want to do is damage your slave to the point where they're not productive. So lots of expenses here, right? And guys, I really can't emphasize this enough. When we get to the Civil War, and people are like, they wouldn't want to fight for slaves, that seems like an odd choice. Ordinary people in America right now are not billionaires, right? Ordinary people in America do not own a vast real estate and enterprise in Manhattan. They don't own a plane with their name on the side. But if that person told them we should go to war tomorrow, would they believe it? If the President of the United States said that, right? Regardless if that person actually looks like them, lives like them, is like them, okay? So when the leadership class of the South says, we're going to fight, keep in mind it's the leadership that do things like secession. It's not your ordinary people on the street, although they celebrate it, because they, again, see this as those Yankee invaders wanting to put who on top of it. This is their whole fear, one of the major fears of Lincoln. Yes, because in several southern states, who are the majority of people? African Americans. Right? People of color make up the majority. So that means overnight, South Carolinian whites will be a minority. Right? So why do you think so many people in America are alarmed right now about ethnic diversity? Because by the year 2050, 2036, actually, I think the year I saw it today, white people will no longer be the majority. That's horrible. When that day comes, there'll be a reckoning on all white people, let's put it. All those white folks are going to pay for something. I don't know. So anyway, that's the fear. Now, for those of you who are curious, it doesn't mean that white people in America will still be the plurality. Yeah, no plurality, right? Not over 50%. So it'll be like 48%, and so it shouldn't matter. But to a lot of people, that matters a huge deal, particularly because of fear. A lot of fear. Well, there was a lot of fear that these folks said, what the heck? What happened with Nat Turner? What happened? What did these slaves do with guys like Nat Turner? By the way, I don't really blame people like Nat Turner for doing what they did. I just wish the history of it looked different. Murdering 10 kids is hard to justify in anybody's mind. You understand? It's just hard. Now, we drop bombs on places that kill kids, right? But when you consider the slave rebellions, this is the thing that most horrified Southern whites. Not just Southern wealthy whites either, by the way, but Southern who? Normal whites, so to speak. So I talked to you about this was a business, right? This industry of buying and selling people. So if people would look, we have an industry in America we call it flipping houses. You guys familiar with flipping houses? Yep. So this fella, and this is like a copy out of the journal, showing how the prices vary. And this was very common. And by the way, for many, 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 in fact, there's 1,700 families that were these massive planters, like 100 people plus. So they were massively in debt. So people don't know about President Trump, for example. He's massively in debt. He owes literally like $1 billion that's coming due next year. So the thing about rich people is they're able to live very rich, but they owe a lot of money often. The more money you have, the more money you borrow. Thomas Jefferson, so much in debt, they had to sell Monticello. Okay? He was already in debt once, and sell his entire library. What do they call his library? The Library of Congress. All right, so when Congress needed a library, they had a collection of books. Thomas Jefferson's like, here, I'll sell you all my books. Then a couple years later, he borrowed money and built a whole new library.
I just remembered that they sold
Yeah,
the library.
He sold them to Congress. Yeah, that became the Library of Congress, the very beginning of that institution. So rich people, but often massively in debt. Okay, and often because of this. Not that much sympathy. So yeah, this is what I'm talking about being afraid. All right, when you live in South Carolina, you live in Georgia, you live in Alabama, Mississippi, the population is right there on the verge of 50-50. Okay? So lots of discussion yesterday about how the slave community, if you want to call it that, resisted. The least common, but by far the most notable, is the what? Rebellion. So the most common was simply working slow. Okay? Like, I've read numerous diaries, and I've read probably a dozen or more journals of like slave owners, part of my studies in history. And almost to the letter, every one of them, throughout their diaries, will complain about some lazy slave. They're always complaining about so-and-so doesn't do any work, doesn't get any work done. And you're like sitting there thinking, oh, of course they don't. Like, what's their motivation? I can't get high school students to do work, and nobody's beating you with a stick, right? So the point is that most people without an incentive beyond pain aren't going to work very hard, right? Like, they didn't get anything for it. And what's really interesting to me is the efforts to bribe their slaves at times. So this was very common. This sort of pretense. By the way, this is where you get ugly words like a house N-word. And I don't like hearing the N-word, but it was very common back then. If I ever say it, it's only in a quote. I only like to say it in a quote. So this is a sort of caricature of the loyal house servant who you could depend on to kind of handle your business. And not always was that flawless. This is Genevieve's theory. But regardless, this is the type of person who frequently appeared on the outside to be ignorant. Now, I think that's done some damage to the culture. African-American culture had a 1-2 punch when it came to being educated. And again, I don't want to single any students out, but every year when I have African-American students taking AP classes, I'm hurt. All right? Not because I'm discriminatory, but because there are two things that are huge setbacks that we're still dealing with. One, throughout the entire history of slavery, what was illegal? You couldn't read or write. That was illegal, right? Then from 1877 to 1954, okay, education for African Americans was absolutely abysmal. why we ended up having Brown versus Board of Education, right? So if you think about 1954, that's not that long ago, right? That's like great-grandparents or grandparents' age. So when we talk about education as a community, it is uncharacteristic historically to have educated African Americans. Now, there are extraordinary exceptions. Booker T. Washington, okay, W.B. Du Bois, these folks happened. But years ago, I was teaching two bright guys in APUSH. They were African American guys, and they were both on the basketball team, and they would catch grief from their teammates about taking AP. They call it white people class because black people weren't supposed to take AP was the impression, which is preposterous. But somewhere in the culture, we have to change the mentality that governor school is just for white people. You understand? And that's hard because for a long time after Brown, African Americans were treated with very low expectations. You understand? Particularly white teachers didn't expect much from their black students. So they didn't teach them very much. And that's also true, by the way, of poor white people, not just black people. Although it's much truer for black people because of the long-term history. But for growing up in a poor white community where less than 10% of the community had a college degree, that meant people with college degrees were sort of the abnormal people, right? People who were well educated. Oh, that's nothing wrong with those people. There's something weird about them. And so being a person in a family who had a college educated parent, I knew that was doable for normal people from the South, so to speak. But we have to, and again, I'm not always a fan of George W. Bush, but one of the things he said that I'll always remember is that we must struggle, we must fight to overcome the soft bigotry of low expectations. You understand what that means? Soft bigotry, not like overt racism, of low expectations. Well, you can learn how to be a janitor. You can be a custodian, right? You can work with your hands on a menial task. That's what black people were told. What a lot of poor white people were told. Education shouldn't be class-oriented, right? It should be available to all people. But, unfortunately, we still are struggling with it, but it's a recent legacy. It's not like ancient history, okay? So this is the origin of the acting like an ignorant person, Not to say that these are stupid people, but they got away with, behind the scenes, doing things, like pilfering money or food or getting messages to their friends. If on the surface you look at them and you're like, oh, I can trust so-and-so. You understand? So this was common, right? It's a subgroup. Told you about this, and of course the significance of the Underground Railroad. By the way, this is not going to be as big a deal until the 1840s. I don't want to oversell this yet, but it'll get there. Once slavery in the Deep South gets harsher, then the Underground Railroad is going to get more and more active. As slavery spreads, abolitionism grows. So it's like a cause and effect relationship. Let's get into the abolitionist discussion today. And I did talk about Nat Turner is a fascinating character to study. If you take some professors' classes, Nat Turner is a heroic figure who serves as a role model. You think other teachers, this is the savagery of runaway slaves. I think it's both. I think this is an example of fury unleashed, fury against slavery, right? And unfortunately, again, this is a lesson of history for women not getting enough food for their kids in Paris in 1789, right? Off with their heads, okay? Women, soldiers in Russia in 1917 not being able to feed each other, shooting the Tsar, right? So when people, and killing a whole lot of other people, when people get upset and angry, unfortunately, they don't often sit back and say, oh, well, gee, we should discriminate on who we kill and who we don't. And so what, of course, the impact of Nat Turner is that it meant who were now a lot more scared. White people. White people were like, oh, gosh, we can't let these people go. They're gonna kill us, right? I would point out all that positive defense of slavery yesterday. If people are hacking 55 people to death, it's probably not because they like it, right? If slavery was so good, then why do people keep trying to run away from it? I don't consider that a fallacy. Like it's not that good if you're a slave. Now, the argument is by most of these defenders is that it was better than what you would have had. That's preposterous, but in other words, if you're an African, you're probably going to be, life's going to be a lot worse in Africa than if you're a Negro in America. Your clothes, you have a house, stuff like that. So this is a key shift in the attitude of Southern defenders of slavery. Please pick up on this. The idea that it went from being evil to it's beneficial. It's actually a decent thing we're doing. And that's a typical form of cognitive dissonance. You guys understand cognitive dissonance? If you stood in this room and said cheating is immoral and unethical, and then in order to make a good grade in my class, you cheated, you're not going to call yourself immoral and unethical, right? See, at least Jefferson was smart enough to say, yeah, I'm a slaveholder and it's bad, right? But that doesn't ring well in your head, does it? Like, I do this thing knowing that it's bad. So instead of saying that over and over, because that sounds really bad, it's kind of like the ends justify the means, very Machiavellian. No, instead, you say, what? It's not bad at all. It's good for them. And of course, this are the few people who actually are going to say, well, that's probably not true. Let's get into today the abolitionist movement. I do want to really emphasize these were a small number of people. Smaller in number than the number of slaveholders. Much smaller. Okay, so they're a very well organized minority, if that makes sense. And one of the lessons of history is that a few highly motivated individuals can affect far more than millions of uninterested individuals. Understand? And so you think about things like, what's some of the stuff we've already been talking about? The American Revolution started out as a very small movement, but it's a flame that lights, hopefully a larger fire. So the first form of abolitionism predates the American states, and that was the Quakers. I always like to give the Quakers a shout out because they wrote petitions against slavery to the King of England in the 1700s. They're like, this is immoral, this is evil, this is sinful. So they're the folks that are talking about it in a moral context, right? This is immoral what you're doing. This is a very famous image that comes out of the early abolitionist movement. Am I not a man? Okay, and a brother, a fellow who. See, I've been trying to teach you guys this, and there's some people who get so offended. Race is a social construct, right? You understand? It's something that we basically take the pigment in our skin and determine that applies to your heredity, thus you're different. Now, of course, nations of origin are not social constructs, right? Nationality. But over time, particularly in America, what we've learned about race is that there is no single race. Okay? Not even close. But the laws at the time said, depending on your who, you were a Negro or not. Your mom. That's right. So if your mom was determined to be a Negro, you're a Negro. Okay? As late as 1896, you're going to have a case called Plessy versus Ferguson. Very famous case. 1896. We're talking a long time after this stuff. Right? And in it, the state of Louisiana is going to determine that Homer Plessy, who is 7/8 white, he's what would have been called at that time an octoroon, 1/8 black. Well, they called that a black person. That 1/8. It sounds like what the Nazis did when they were trying to figure out blood, how much blood should be pure German Aryan blood. 7/8 white, they denied him a seat on a white car for streetcar. Crazy stuff, but there you go. So we talked about both Thomas Jefferson and particularly Madison and Monroe as well could not envision what element of emancipation, like what was inconceivable for them. Shouldn't have been. But these three men were slaveholders, so their perspective on who African Americans were was very different than, say, a non-slaveholder. But even then, it's really a stretch. But what did they think was inconceivable? I showed you Jefferson's quote earlier. That was about having the wolf by the ears. Okay. Anybody? They thought it was impossible for a biracial society. You understand? It was inconceivable to have the people who were slaves become free and then harmoniously coexist with the people who used to own them as a society. They couldn't see a way because they were racist. I mean, I have a lot of respect and admiration for Thomas Jefferson, but at the end of the day, their views on race were these are inferior people. No, and they thought the science could not allow those two societies to live, unfortunately. So what that led to then was an idea that was not singularly Northern or Southern, but it was the colonization movement. And so your first, like, sort of official abolitionist group in America is the ACS, made up of Northerners and Southerners. And they believe that colonization through paid emancipation, like, for example, Jefferson wants this, pay Southerners for their slaves and then allow those slaves, free men now, to go to Africa. There will be African Americans who consider this, by the way, and there will be some African Americans who do this, who colonize West Africa. So if you look at the country of Liberia, Liberia is literally a colony of the United States. Like, we made it, in West Africa. And over time, thousands and thousands of African Americans do move here. Okay? So during the age of imperialism, when I'm teaching that unit on Africa, there are two countries during the 19th century in Africa that avoid being imperialized. One is Ethiopia, by its actual military success over Italy, and the other is what? Liberia, because of the protection of the United States, our colonies, so to speak. All right. So I want you to put the camps of abolitionists into two groups. This is often, like, if you talk to environmentalists today, and I'm an environmentalist. I'm a person who believes in environmental protection. But at the same time, I'm not a militant. What I mean by that is that if you slam people over the head with something, they usually are not going to like it. If you gradually make changes, they'll adapt. Right? So you have so I'm a gradualist by that account. If we start solving the problem of national debt now, it will become a catastrophe later. Right? So gradual fix, kind of works better. I recognize that education is a gradual progress, not just something that happens your junior year in high school or your senior year, over time. The most famous gradualist is a guy who actually found the key group, but his name is Theodore Dwight Will. And they understood that there were enormous social and economic ramifications of ending slavery. You understand? They knew there was going to be heavy pushback from where? From the South, particularly Southern lawmakers who were slave owners, right? So if you're going to, here's my attitude whenever I talk to, like, reformers or people who are agitating for something. Is it because of the cause or because you want outcomes? Right? Are you doing it for the principle of the thing, just to be doing it? Former President Obama just spoke the other day, and one of the things he urged progressives to stop doing is say defund the police. He's like, you are not going to be successful if you use the phrase defund the police. It's stupid. Stop talking that way, because what it does is it immediately alienates millions of people who you don't need to do that to. Right? So if you come at me and say end slavery tomorrow, how are some people going to respond? That's going to be pushed back, right? So the gradualists were like, we have to find a way to gradually end it. And usually what they landed on was compensation. Compensation meant pay out of the government, out of taxation, slave owners for their property. That way they don't just go broke overnight. And then free blacks after that. Question of free blacks usually was responded by some with colonization, others with free country after that. Should be able to live where they want to. So that is sort of kind of what we might call in political terms the pragmatics, the pragmatists, the ones that are like, we recognize the reality of the problem. And then you have what are called the militants. And in many ways, the militants are necessary because without the extreme, the moderate looks extreme. You understand? And I have great respect for them because what they said was totally true. It just wasn't very practical. And many times the gradualists will get really angry at the militants for stop saying this because you're actually hurting the cause more than helping. You understand? So there was this debate over it. But Garrison, who we're going to talk about in a minute, was an uncompromising. The problem Weld would say about Garrison is that your uncompromising hurts black people. Like, because you refuse to compromise at all or gradually do stuff, nothing is getting done. I have said for years to my students and to people, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. You understand? If you hold out for perfection, guess what you usually get? Nothing, right? You won't get it. There's nothing wrong with trying to work towards that goal. And rhetoric is the language you use is important. But he wants immediate emancipation. Okay? So the fact that these two groups were almost singularly, by the way, Garrison is going, well, I'll talk about Garrison, but they're singularly devoted. That makes sense? I try not to have too many pans in the fire, so to speak, because if you're working on 8 or 9 causes, then what kind of work are you doing?
Next to none.
You're being divided. It's not been helpful for me this semester to have 3 different preps. So rather than being able to focus on AP US history or AP government or world history, I'm having to divide my, hey, it's part of the job. But it's been particularly difficult this year because we've had to reinvent the wheel a little bit, right? I kind of refuse to do. Sorry. So anyway, make sure that you understand it's this kind of attitude that keeps it in the public's eye. If you were my student 20 years ago, I was talking about the national debt. You know, for 20 years, I've been talking about the same topic. If I recorded it, you could go back and look at it. Even when we were running surpluses, I was talking about the national debt, right? So I'm on a couple, they're called special interest groups, or sometimes in our call public interest groups. And I focus on 4 or 5 issues. And that's it. But even that's a lot. Okay? So today, one of the things that really is frustrating is, like, say you want an environmental support. Environmentalists in California demanded that the school system of California, several of the counties in California, incorporate language about Black Lives Matter. Nothing wrong with having coalitions, but it does come across weird for an environmentalist at a school policy meeting talking about Black Lives Matter. Are you trying to get environmental policies? Or are you talking about education? You understand? It confuses the audience, right? Among other things. And it splits your time. So these folks are almost uniquely devoted to this. Very dedicated few. So let's look at the first. So Weld, as you can see, was one of the youngest, or one of the earliest. And Weld is going to create the first abolitionist group that's not based on colonization. It is called the American Anti-Slavery Society, so you should be familiar with it. This is the first national abolitionist group that's not talking about repatriation. Patriation. Weld was the first. Now, he's not the most famous, but he is the one that many others were inspired by. Okay? He was at Oberlin College. You guys remember Oberlin? All right. It was, in terms of gender, it was integrated, right? Co-ed. And who else could go there?
It was interracial.
Interracial, right. It was desegregated. So Oberlin was one of the second Great Awakening ministerial colleges that were very progressive for their time. But even he was too radical. Because his discussion of slavery, they're like, hey, you're doing it too much. And I shouldn't say too radical, just too much. And Charles Finney, you guys remember that name? One of the ministers of the Second Great Awakening. So this is the Second Great Awakening's biggest outcome is abolitionism. Okay, that religious inspiration. And do you remember the Grimke sisters? That name may not ring a bell, but white plantation owners' daughters who became abolitionists. They're from South Carolina. And South Carolina, but they moved up to the north. And they gave speaking engagements and wrote about the evil of slavery as white Southern women, okay? And he was married to Angelina Grimke. So definitely be familiar with like Weld and know the American Anti-Slavery Society, okay? The first abolitionist group. Now, within the abolitionist groups like that, you have the Tappan brothers. Now, the Tappan brothers are interesting to me because they are like millionaires. So one of the things that's always useful for a group is to have a rich benefactor. If you understand what that means, like somebody will fund your operations. And so these guys were already rich. They were importers. You can see they also were business partners with this guy, Samuel Morse. So they were early successful entrepreneurs. And so sort of by their middle ages, they were retired from business. And they began using their wealth to publish abolitionist materials. They ran printing presses, like publication house, to print abolitionist material. So much so that what happened to them? A riot broke out where they destroyed their press, dragged Lewis Tappan out of the street, beat him up, right? Probably would have killed him if who hadn't intervened?
Military.
Right. So, these are white people beating up white people over the issue of slavery. Okay? So, no Lewis Tappan. We usually talk about Lewis Tappan. He's also the guy who will pay for the defense of the Amistad captives. Did I tell you about Amistad yesterday? The boat, the ship that came from Portugal that went to West Africa after the international slave trade had been banned. Okay, so these people were kidnapped. They were kidnapped always, but these were now in violation of international law kidnapped. Brought to the Americas, they were sold in Cuba, put on another ship, a Spanish ship, which was then going to take them probably to some Spanish territory, some Latin American colony or city, state. But they rebelled, on the ship. And they actually seized the control of the ship and made the captain the guy who led it, his name was Cinque. So sometimes called Cinque revolt. Not a revolt when you're being a slave, I think. But anyway, Cinque demanded, he knew which direction was east, and he wanted the ship captain to sail them back to Africa. Now, keep in mind, the Portuguese ships are massive, that were the slave ships. This ship was not massive, this Amistad ship. And the captain, at night, would negotiate northward, would sail the ship northward. So instead of going just due east, they were going northeast. And what that does, if you go from the Caribbean northeast, it puts you right on the outside of Massachusetts. So that's where they ran aground, so to speak. The ship was stopped by an American sort of Coast Guard patrol. And they're like, what are y'all doing? Who are you? And of course, nobody on the ship spoke English or any other European language. So this guy, Lewis Tappan, pays for an attorney and finds a translator. And they started defending these Africans who are on the ship. And the question is, what is the condition of these people? So under the rules of maritime law, folks, the sailors who took the ship get to keep the property on. So the sailors sued and said, those are our slaves. Under the international law, it was a Spanish ship. The Queen of Spain said, no, they're our people. All right. New Englanders said, oh, no. These are free people, some of them, like Lewis Tappan. And so this debate over who these people were starts to heat up. Ultimately, the case goes all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And Tappan's financing the defense of the Amistad slaves. And John Quincy Adams represents the Amistad slaves. John Quincy Adams is now Congressman Adams. He lost the re-election for presidency to Andrew Jackson. And so then he gets elected to Congress. And there, Tappan pays for him to defend these folks. And the Supreme Court rules that these are free people who were captured. And pays for, the federal government will pay for their return back. That's one of the more interesting cases. It doesn't make it in your book, but cool story. Now, another thing that emerges, interestingly enough, is another one of these single parties. So we've had a couple single issue parties, anti-Masons, know-nothings. And so now you have the very first political party that makes the end of slavery an objective. And you need to know the name, the Liberty Party. So the Liberty Party is a single issue party to abolish slavery. They'll run a candidate in 2 elections, not any major success, but they're going to put the idea of abolitionism in more people's ears. Okay? So Lewis Tappan, James Birney, Theodore Weld, but here's the biggest name. Well, one of the 2 biggest names. This is William Lloyd Garrison, who is the most militant of militants. He is sort of baptized in holy fire. And so for him, the war against slavery is a holy war. He is a religious zealot, we might say. All right. And he believed that these institutions you didn't compromise with evil. You understand? You don't come up with moderate solutions to evil. And so he was vehemently opposed to it. And very, very much a successful spokesperson. He creates a newspaper that is while not read by many, read by important people. So you should know Garrison's publication, The Liberator. However, Garrison gets kind of in trouble with the Anti-Slavery Society. The problem is he wants to solve every moral problem in America. He is opposed to alcohol. He wants women to have rights. He liked the graham cracker diet. And he was quick to tell you all those things. So, you're going to be a vegetarian, and women are going to have rights, and black people are going to be slaves. They're going to fix everything that's wrong in America. And so the Anti-Slavery Society said, wait a minute, you're confusing the message. And so he's like, well, if you can't handle my energy, I'm out of here. All right, so he splits with the American Anti-Slavery Society, okay, with Weld, and because they also don't like the fact that he's a militant. Like his rhetoric is so inflammatory, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Inflammatory. All right. On the subject of slavery, I will be as harsh as truth and uncompromising as justice. I do not wish to think with moderation. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat, and I will be heard. That's the first publication. He calls the Constitution a covenant with hell and destroys it. So here's where the problem is, right? Moderate, normal American people don't like folks that are destroying the Constitution. Moderate, normal American people don't like the phrase defund the police. You understand? So by being so, again, it's in the Constitution about slavery. Three-fifths compromise, it's right in there, okay? But by being so inflammatory, which again, it's religious zeal, it's enthusiasm, some people would say he alienates the people he's trying to reach. But I say you can't get success without these types of people, because they have to make it seem so radical that you're willing to say, okay, well, what's the next step? All right, if there's a spread of slavery, okay. You understand? So that's him. So I definitely know him. Now he's more famous for The Liberator. This is the most famous speaker of abolitionism besides the great Frederick Douglass. He was called, this is Wendell Phillips, so all these names are down here, or should be down here. You should be filling in like each one. You have to make a distinction between each of these folks, particularly. So Phillips was a public speaker who was considered by many to be the most personally, not the most rhetorically, but he's the one who led what's called the free produce movement. He refused to wear any product made by slaves. So he's starting boycotts. You may recall that Gandhi's success is going to become when he tells the people of India to not purchase or produce or create anything for Britain. Right?
Boycott sugar cane.
Wendell Phillips?
Didn't he also boycott sugar cane?
Yeah, sugar is one of the things right there. Boycott sugar cane, cloth from cotton, anything that slaves might have produced. Okay? Keep in mind, both he and William Lloyd Garrison are almost killed by mobs. Lynch mob. Okay? And he is one of the founders of a formal part of the Underground Railroad. So if you see this Boston, by the way, in New England, you can imagine, as was Garrison. Garrison and Phillips are in Boston, the cradle of liberalism, right? But he was part of something called the Boston Vigilance Committee, which was a group that would help runaway slaves. In other words, they were known to do this. Here you have some of the very first specific examples of some people in America, like overtly undermining slavery, meaning helping runaway slaves, not just talking about the evil of slavery or publishing newspapers about it, but actually helping runaway slaves in New England. Now, this event in 1837 was going to be the event that changes people's minds a lot in this country. Even Abraham Lincoln could be shot right to that. This is the murder of Elijah Lovejoy. All right? So you got Phillips here. He was a not radical, but a militant abolitionist. Okay? And he was printing material, reprinting material from particularly the American Anti-Slavery Society, the Liberator, stuff like that. And his neighbors in Alton, Illinois. So we're not talking about in the South. In Illinois, Lincoln's going to be a member of Congress in 10 years. So this is the kind of stuff that's going to leave an impression. Lincoln is going to read about firsthand, and people are going to read about a white man in America was murdered by white men in America over what issue? So we call him in history the martyr abolitionist, meaning he was killed because he opposed slavery. Now, Garrison was almost killed. Phillips was almost killed. But Elijah Lovejoy will actually be murdered, and his press will be thrown in the river. And so, in other words, when we talk about abolitionism, it was hugely unpopular. These folks were rocking the boat. They were disrupting society as we were used to it. And that's often how people are received at the beginning of movements. Tragically. Okay, so know the martyr abolitionist, Elijah Lovejoy. For some reason, antebellum Americans love trees. Yeah. Could be because we chop so many of them down. But whenever you see things depicted as content, as ideas, they're trees, be it temperance or abolitionism, right? So here is the tree of slavery, which is the root of all evil, right? Injustice, anarchy, terrible, greed, brutality, robbery, villainy. Now, again, I do want to point out that people who live in Boston didn't know too many black folks. So the Southerners criticize them as saying, it's easy for you to talk about any of this. It won't what? It won't affect you. You know, it's not your problem, so shut up. But they're going to argue it is our problem. Because who are these people? They're people. They're fellow human beings. And in my country, they're being enslaved. Okay? In my country, in America. But, you know, most people are like out of sight, out of mind. You guys don't really know about things. The problem, why? Why do most people not want to know about problems? I heard a couple voices.
You said why don't?
Yeah, why don't we want to hear about problems?
It's stressful.
Stress? Okay, sure, yeah. Got no problem behind. Is that what you said? Yeah, got enough problems behind. I'm going to hear about some other big problem, right? Quote. Anybody else?
I just thought it was like it's a nuisance, it's a burden.
People don't want to deal with the problems of it. Yeah. People don't want to deal with the problems of others.
Don't want to deal with other people's problems? Yeah. Especially when they make it your problem, right? And that's how they feel. They're like, you guys are making this a problem for us. Like, the problem is slavery, but that's not how they view it. They view what is the problem. Abolitionists for the problem, you understand? So rather than say, let's fix slavery, because slavery is an enormous institution. So in America, a lot of times, this is shooting a messenger. You know, it's like, it's not really a problem because it doesn't affect me. Right? It's not my problem. And you're making it my problem? No, thank you. So this is how abolitionism kind of didn't get going very much. What you got to do is change public opinion. Normal people do. See, I always love these people. You know why? I always hope these will be my students, people. Not necessarily the martyr abolitionists, but
They changed the norm of society.
right.
They defied the norm.
They're the ones who saw the problem before everybody else did. You understand? And faced a lot of opposition for seeing the problem. Okay? But eventually, the rest of the people began to see the problem. All right? So somebody has to be at the start. There's got to be Martin Luther. But before there was Martin Luther, you know who came? It's okay. A guy named John Huss. You know that man? They burned him at the stake. Before there was John Calvin, there was Ulrich Zwingli. So what happens is we need people to take this risk. And of course, who we're not going to be listened to much? Free black people. Unless they were this guy. I want to jump to him first. Where is he? Oh my gosh, there he is. This man was so extraordinarily gifted as far as an orator and a writer that people couldn't believe that this guy can't be black, right? You know, so it's very, very hard at that time in history for people to accept that abolitionists who were black were anything more than like puppets of white people, as if they don't have more vested in it. But Frederick Douglass is his autobiography, with great bestsellers, is such an interesting expose on what life as a slave is like, that people read this and they can't even believe it was written by a slave. Frederick Douglass, who, by the way, is going to be a gradualist. Now, why would he be a graduate?
Right.
He's pragmatic. He wants slavery to end tomorrow. But he realizes if that's what you ask for, that's not what you're going to get. Right? So he would rather end slavery completely at some point. And so Frederick Douglass is going to become one of the most significant African Americans in all of history, and particularly by the time of the Civil War. This will be the man who convinces Abraham Lincoln that who should fight as soldiers, and they will ultimately make up about a fifth of the Union Army. The former slaves, right? Former freedmen. The freedmen are going to be in the Union Army as a result of this guy, his active campaign. You understand? Because he's going to say, this is our fight that you're fighting for. We should be a part of our fight, so to speak. And so Douglass will be probably the most famous African American in our country at the time. And he will go on speaking. Remember the Lyceum lectures? So what he is a walking example. I'm going to teach you about in the 1950s, a guy named Jackie Robinson. You guys know Jackie Robinson? Great baseball player. One of the greatest. Jackie Robinson, when he was hired, was the first African American to what they call break the color barrier, which means to play in the all-white Major League Baseball teams. And he was the example that everyone watching looked at. And that meant there was this enormous pressure on him, right? Unbelievable pressure. Well, Douglass had the same experience. Because anything that they did wrong, would people seize on that. So I always think about Dr. King and others, like when the microscope is on you that much, the pressure must be extraordinary. I can't imagine. So Douglass is the key figure here. He writes and publishes his autobiography and a journal, a periodical called the North Star. So he's another one of these publishers. But let me take you back and teach you a couple other folks who usually get ignored here or overlooked. We've talked a lot about the white abolitionists, but now I'd like to talk about black abolitionists, who are rarer, as you can imagine. Keep in mind, it would require that you be able to read and write, hard to do. And so one of your first ones, whose timing couldn't really come much worse for the original idea, is David Walker. Now, David Walker's book comes out, right? His followers publish it, his friends within the anti-slavery movement, abolition movement. And it is an appeal to black people around the world to rebel. Keep in mind, 2 years later, Nat Turner. So this is not a huge success in terms of inspiring a mass. Because keep in mind, who doesn't read it? Yeah, slaves are going to be like perusing an appeal to the colored citizens of the world. But what he says is a very fascinating sort of militant approach, rather than you're not going to get freedom without what? Without taking it, without fighting for it. So he says, and by the way, he's writing to colonies too. He's writing to people like what had just happened in Haiti. You must fight for your freedom because people aren't going to give it to you. All right? Can't wait around for it. So David Walker, a violent war for end of slavery. The folks that have the most success are the ones that, rather than raging against the machine, like Garrison and Walker there, are the ones who actually work within the machine. And they can't have a better example of that than Martin Delany. Martin Delaney's a really fascinating story, and I think he's in your book. So this is Martin Delany. He is a Harvard medical school student, all right? He was the one that went around with Frederick Douglass. So usually it's Douglass and Delany, okay, on speaking engagement. And he is the biggest advocate for Liberia. He at the time believes that what's not possible, really. What's not possible from a black person's perspective, you believe? To coexist with white people, right? He's like, the white people won't coexist with you. Not black people aren't going to coexist, it's white people. Like, sorry, they're not going to let us live here, okay? So he goes there and he actually gets agreements to create more territory in what would be Liberia. He comes back, and that's when the Civil War happens. Comes back after having gone over for a couple of years. And he will recruit with Frederick Douglass. You remember Frederick Douglass is like the speaker guy. He's going to actually go out and actively campaign to get soldiers, black soldiers. So he's like the recruiter. And during the war, he is the only person at that point in American history to be a black person who is an officer in the military. All right, so he will become a major. There's a major Martin Delany, U.S. Army. Okay, so that's, what a neat story. I mean, so Harvard med, major, Martin Delany. Okay, and he stays here, I think, after the war, you know, because of his success and the success of the war. Yeah. So nonetheless, I would definitely be familiar with the difference between Walker and Delany, their attitudes and what they believe. And then we have the other great speaker of the period. And I know this feels like a laundry list of people. And unfortunately, I can't approach it really much other way than that. Like, I'm going to talk about Harriet Tubman more later, and Sojourner Truth some more later. But Sojourner Truth is fascinating to me because she was a writer, a poet, and a public speaker. And she was a feminist. So she was a black female advocate for women's rights, which made her kind of unusual, you know, because not only is she advocating for black people's rights, she's advocating for black women's rights. And she has a poem that I've actually recited, not out of mockery, but out of respect, called Ain't I a Woman? Oh, we read that. All right, you guys are familiar with it. Good. You know, so I've actually done it from memory for the governor's school years ago, not your governor's school, one at Richmond, because it was, I think, the anniversary of her death or something. I forget the moment. But to me, as a white male, I recognize what that symbolizes. White middle-class male, that's the man, more or less, right? Life has not been overtly easy for me, but I have had very few obstacles. The obstacles I've had are mostly self-created. So I think about people like Sojourner Truth who overcame enormous obstacles that were not her creation, but rather society's creation. And so from then on, I've always tried to approach what I do as, you know, everyone has extraordinary stories. You understand? Like if I create an obstacle that's unfair and artificial, then that would be what happened to Sojourner Truth. I don't want to do that, you know, and I want her to be, she's to me one of the great heroines of history because her willingness to risk assault. You guys do see that people are being killed for advocating this stuff, right? And her clearness. So you guys read about it, right? You read her ability to evoke this sort of tragic femininity of being a mother and a mother of slaves, right? Like how awful must that have been? Like, I can't. It's why we have art, so we can remotely relate to it emotionally. Yeah. So she's great, and definitely be familiar with it. Another key figure, and she is going to become, I think today, probably the most recognized lady of this period, as far as African American abolitionism, and that is the Black Moses, they call it. Harriet Tubman, you guys seen the movie? Harriet, really good. It was made like last year. I know it's the movie I think last year. It's on either Netflix or Amazon or one of those. But she is going to make the decision to escape. So she starts out as a runaway, and when she gets to, I want to say Pennsylvania, I think it's Philadelphia, she realizes that it was probably luck that got her there. You know, luck and I mean, she wasn't a survivalist. You understand? Like that was. So she thinks that, well, what I have done can be retraced, and I can do this again better. So she goes back. Imagine she's working with abolitionists who are like publishing stuff, you know, and then she rolls in and she's got like 4 slaves with her. And they're like, oh my God, you went and rescued 4 people? And she's like, yeah, I'm headed back to get more. And so she kept doing this, and she helped over 300 people escape. There was a massive bounty on her head. Look at this. That's like $1 million. Understand? Like $1 million bounty. So she was infamous, I guess let me lay this out. People, particularly in Virginia, all right, Maryland, that area. Okay? And during the Civil War, because she had not easily, but she had routinely gone back and forth from Pennsylvania into the South, that meant she could keep doing that. So she'll be one of Lincoln's spies. She's a really neat person, I think, personally. And there's a great movie about her called Harriet, which I would recommend. Okay, leading through the swamps, so to speak. So here's the Underground Railroad. Now, I do think I saw this the other day, and it was in, I forget, but maybe I can find it and put it in the PowerPoint. Somebody asked me the other day, what about Mexico? And the truth is, there was an Underground Railroad into Mexico. It wasn't as big or notable, but I'll start with the fact that Mexico had abolished slavery, and you could escape to Mexico as a runaway slave. Not as easy because you had to get through Texas, and you don't know what it's like, but it's big. But typically, the objective was to get above the Ohio River. So if you see what is called the Mason-Dixon line, I think I have it. But the Mason-Dixon line is Pennsylvania's border with Maryland. So the Mason-Dixon line, and of course you get this little part of Wheeling, West Virginia and all that stuff that sticks up. But, you know, Ohio is the Ohio River Valley along Kentucky. So that's where slavery was. So these folks, and again, you can see the green here. What's the green nickname? Okay, the Black Belt, the Cotton Kingdom. This is the one we looked at yesterday with the population of African Americans. So it was hardest to escape from the Deep South. Most of the escapees were from the Upper South. Okay, but they had quite a bit of success. So much so that Congress is going to pass a major law outlawing what they do in 1850. They're going to be so effective that Southerners are going to demand a law that stops the Underground Railroad. Okay, because again, if you're stealing, again, I say steal. By the way, one of the most famous Negro spirituals of the time is called "Steal Away," meaning steal yourself. I've stolen myself, so that I'm free now. 300 slaves at an average price, so let's just say today's terms, 80,000. You know, awful numbers, right? Was 80,000 times 300? 20 million, 24 million, all right? Yeah. $20 million worth of property. You know, that's how she was viewed in the South. This theft of $20 million. That's extraordinary, right? Yeah, Underground Railroad. Until you had language that went along with that. She was a conductor. She would lead you on the path, so to speak. These are your passengers. Okay? So this was the kind of language they would use. Depots, I told you about the Boston Vigilance Society. They would help. All right? Okay. So out of this becomes an attitude, slowly, of maybe we should end slavery in America. All right? Initially, so you have three parties that are going to have some opposition to slavery in their platform. The Liberty Party is the only one that is an outright abolitionist party. Right? Abolition. But the emerging attitude by moderates of this period, like Abraham Lincoln, is slavery is, while terrible, unfortunately legal. But we don't have to let it spread. Okay? And so that becomes what is known in history as the free soil movement. No spread of slavery. Now, part of the reason is completely selfish. Why would men like Abraham Lincoln's voters, his constituents, not want the spread of slavery? If you're in Illinois, that's where he's from. It's the Great Plains, you know, Kansas, Nebraska, places like that. Agrarian state, very good. They might buy up all the land. So that means if I'm a working class white guy, a yeoman farmer, what am I not going to be able to get? Land. So I don't want to imply that the free soilers were abolitionists. All right. They just don't want to have to compete with slave owners and slavery for jobs and land. But that's progress, right? You know, don't want slavery to spread. So that's, ironically, that's the platform that gets absorbed by the Republican Party. Yet Southerners are going to hear the Republican Party opposed to the spread of slavery and associate it with what? Abolitionism. Abraham Lincoln was not an abolitionist. The free soilers were not abolitionists. They didn't want slavery to what? To spread. Now, he would have loved for slavery to end, but he didn't believe it was whose, like, authority? The federal government. The federal government doesn't have the authority to take away people's property. Fifth Amendment says you have the right to life, liberty, property. It's ironic, I know, because except for the people you own. But the point is like there were no federal laws that could take away slavery. But had there been federal laws that stopped the spread of slavery? Northwest Ordinance, Missouri Compromise. So they're going to say, let's stop the spread of slavery. And then when the Republican Party is born, that's going to be absorbed into their party. Okay? And of course, over the course of the Civil War, well, first of all, I do want to be clear. Lincoln despised slavery. He thought it was immoral. He wrote about it from childhood on. Immediately, he thought his daddy moved north because he didn't want to live in a slave state. They didn't like slavery. It was incompatible with the values of America. But he was not an abolitionist, meaning that he once wrote to an editor, if I could preserve the Union half slave and half free, I'd do it. If I could preserve the Union all slave or all free, I'd do it. I want to preserve the Union. So what was his paramount concern, right? His number one concern? Keeping America as one nation, indivisible, right? But as the course of the Civil War went on, he said, we cannot let these southern states do what they have done without paying a price. Okay? Now, he had always wanted to end slavery, but he never felt like he could do that. What did he need to do that? What's perfect to create while the South ain't voting? The 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery. And then you tell, of course, Lincoln was dead by this point, but you tell him you don't get to come back into the Union until you agree to the 13th Amendment. You understand? Not come back into the Union, but lose military troops. So he will end up opposing slavery to the point where he removes it. But I don't want you to think of Lincoln as an abolitionist, even though he's known to be great emancipator. That was a war effort, war measure. So he'll be a Republican out of that group. Okay? So here's some terms that you might hear. The Mason-Dixon line, I mentioned that. Okay? This is where most scholars writing about this think perhaps the word Dixie comes from. You guys ever heard of Dixieland, I'll take my stand and live down in Dixie? All right? Dixie is like a shortened version of what word? Dixie. So down in Dixie, right? Perhaps. But this and the Ohio River, okay, the boundary. So I've gone over this, but make sure you understand it again. I didn't really explain why Southerners shifted to a positive defense other than economic. Of course, economic is enough for them, right? But another reason is they were afraid of what? Keep in mind, freedmen are just as prone in their minds to commit former slave rebellions and slave rebellion. In other words, if you have a lot of free blacks running around, they're going to kill us, rape our women. All right? Then, what happened? What do you think started appearing in Southern mail? The Liberator. Now, yeah, it's like what drives me nuts about Americans. Americans will turn on the TV and see some nutbag somewhere in Oregon and say, oh, well, that's everybody. You know, and it's not. It's not everybody. Everybody wasn't William Lloyd Garrison, but everybody wasn't writing newspapers. All right, who was? Garrison, Frederick Douglass. So when these guys French hit the South, they assumed the North felt what these guys wrote. Understand? Which then alienated the North and South further. And then you guys remember this? This is the nullification crisis of Andrew Jackson. Well, how did Jackson respond with nullification? Oh, gotta learn this. The Force Act. Congress gave him the authority to do what to South Carolina? Invade it. Invade South Carolina with soldiers, which he had already started. It's sending troops down to South Carolina. So they were afraid that if the South decided to, well, if the North tried to abolish slavery, could they force that on them? Yeah, that's what they were afraid of, just like Jackson had forced the tariff down their throat. Now, I will emphasize till forever, Lincoln does not invade the South to force them to end slavery. All right? But by 1863, that's the price you pay for killing Americans for 2.5 years. You understand? So, different story there. All right, we've covered this. I put it up here again, just to remind you. Here I wanted you to read people write. It's not typical for me to show you overt racist language, but I want you to see it, because when you read people writing this kind of stuff, then you realize they mean it. And they put it in print. The Negro race is inferior to the white race in living in their midst. They will be far outstripped in the chase of free competition. In other words, if black people were free, they're not going to be business leaders. Our Negroes are not only better off as to physical comfort than people up north, but their moral condition is better. Slavery is better than being free people in the north. That's all you can say. You may remember from last chapter, Louis Agassiz. He taught biology and geology at Harvard, not a low education school. One of his future students is a guy named Theodore Roosevelt, right? Heard of him? He's one of the folks who helped create polygenism. Polygenism actually dates back to other ideas like Noah's Ark. You guys familiar with Noah's Ark? Like each of the kids had to be different. Okay. Cain and Abel. Point is that races are genetically, evolutionarily, although he didn't use the word evolution. Didn't use that word. All right, different. So some races are more superior, and this was hugely popular in the 19th century. This attitude of white supremacy. Because that's what it was. It was white supremacy. The black people, well, you guys are more like apes. Irish, yeah, you're more like apes. You understand? So this is called polygenism. And the Negro is beneath white people. That's what they taught. So this, this is at Harvard. We're not talking about some people are like, oh, he's racist. And they were all, yeah. Even the scientists were racist. Okay? All right. Here's the future vice president. Actually, we talked about the vice president of the United States. The condition of the African throughout America, where the ancient relation has been retained, enjoys a degree of health and comfort, meaning where black people and white people are separated. All right? Now, I'll compare with any laboring population in Christendom. It may be added that no other condition or any other age has the Negro race ever attained so high an elevation in morals, intelligence, or civilization because of slavery. Understand? Slavery has made Negroes better off. All right, fair enough. That's his argument. Now, I'm going to come back to this speech a few times. I have an entire PowerPoint on why the Confederacy was racist. Okay, because people are like, oh, okay, here we go. This fella is the vice president of the Confederacy and a U.S. senator from Georgia. His name is Little Alex, Alexander Stephens. Okay, so I want you to read this. He's talking about the Constitution of the Confederacy, Confederate States. Has put at rest forever the old question relating to our peculiar institution. He's using that language himself. African slavery is the proper status of the Negro in our civilization. This was the media calls of the late rupture. He's talking about secession. Jefferson had anticipated, and he did. Jefferson wrote this. This would be the rock upon which the Union would split. Jefferson predicted it would be like poison fruit. We wouldn't be able to figure it out. He was right, Stephen says, but whether he fully comprehended that rock may be doubted. The prevailing ideas entertained by him and guys like John Adams and all those other fools were the enslavement of Africans was in the violation of nature, the law of nature. Here's what it is. That's wrong, socially, morally, politically. It was evil to think that. It was evil to think that black people are equal to white people. In the order of God, the institution will be clear, or be passed away, right? Those ideas were wrong. They rested upon the assumption of the equality of races. This was an error. So he says the reason America fell apart is because guys like Thomas Jefferson were stupid enough to think that races were equal. Our new government is founded on the opposite idea. So when people say, well, what was the Confederacy about? Oh, it's about all kinds of freedom, right? Its foundation, its cornerstone rests on the truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man. The cornerstone of the Confederacy, right? The support of all of it. That slavery subordinate to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. This, our government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this truth. The reason why it's the only one. Wrong. This truth has been slow, blah, blah. All right? Then he comes over here and says, those at the North who cling to these errors with a zeal above knowledge are fanatics. All fanaticism springs from a mess up of your mind, from a defect. It is a form of insanity. You're an abolitionist, you're insane. They assume that the Negro is equal and hence conclude that he is entitled to equal privileges and rights with the white man. He is by nature the curse of Cain, right? So this is the Vice President of the Confederacy, an idea shared by virtually every major Confederate leader. And I've got the evidence to produce to show you. Because people are going to tell you, oh, well, this is Stephen, a little bit odd. No, this is white supremacy at its core. And until this idea is stomped out in America, it'll still be here. You understand? It is still a part of our culture, sadly. But we've come a long way, thank goodness. And so I pointed this out the other day. When he talks about being the only one, he's not wrong. Nobody else had slavery like the South did. Okay, in it, like, ever. That's why it was self-perpetuating. And what happened was, like so many times in history, rather than deal with it, Congress passed a law, a bill that said, you can't talk about it. We won't debate the topic of slavery. It's called the Gag Resolution. See it up here? Gag resolution. In other words, we don't want to narrate whether or not slavery should exist or not. We don't want this because they knew, like Jefferson had said, it would be a dividing point. Now, theoretically, perhaps if all slave owners had been paid for all their slaves and African Americans had been allowed to live in Oklahoma or Nebraska, then maybe America would have progressed, right? But I don't think there was a remote chance of that happening. You know, that the government at that time would barely build a road, much less pay every slave owner in America for slaves. You understand? So this we're gonna discuss about, was the Civil War inevitable? And I don't know that it was inevitable, meaning it had to happen, but it is definitely going to happen. So while you're thinking about the next, chapters, particularly chapter 17 and 18, think about how the acquisition of territory is going to jam this, is going to break this gag resolution. You can't not talk about slavery when you take over new territory. Because what do some people want to do? Take your slaves in, right? And that means other people are going to be like, you can't do that. Meanwhile, who doesn't give up? Who does not give up during this period? This is why I have great admiration for them. Abolitionists, they keep fighting. Harriet Tubman keeps rescuing people. So the thing about guys like Wendell Phillips and Elijah Lovejoy and Frederick Douglass is that their effort is, it's extraordinary. It's decades in the making. Susan B. Anthony, she's going to struggle for women's rights her entire life and never see it happen. All right? Before and after the Civil War, she'll be doing it. So when I see students get frustrated and want to give up, I'm sympathetic. But I think about character is knowing what's the right thing to do and continuing to do it in spite of its difficulty. So these people they're going to try to stop the gag resolution by sending petitions to be read into the record at Congress. Like, you can't stop the freedom of speech. The mail will be searched for any. And so in other words, Southerners are going to stop seeing as much abolition material because they're going to start taking it out of the mail. Postmasters are going to censor the press. But this is that issue. We don't fight a civil war over tariffs. Okay? We don't fight a civil war over taxes. But we're going to fight a civil war over whether or not people can continue to own people. Right? And that's a big deal. I mean, that's the some people consider the Civil War the second existential crisis of America. There have been three. You guys know what the three are? The first is the founding. Like, would we survive as a nation? The beginning. And that's why Washington is routinely ranked so high, because he steered us through those stormy waters. The second is the Civil War. Would we continue as a nation? One nation. And the third is World War II and the Great Depression. Would we utterly reinvent ourselves in a way that wasn't America anymore? And so far we've passed all three. So I hope I hope this is temporary. This is temporary. All right. We're going to find a vaccine and people are going to start, seeing the virus go down. It won't be Walking Dead. We're going to return to some sort of normality. But, the inability to solve our existential crises has led to great conflict. Understand? And that's why we have to be vigilant on it. Okay? So I want to thank you guys for this chapter and again for your patience. And, I will post a quiz. You should have it finished by Monday. Any questions? Now would be a good time from the study guide or otherwise.
Which chapter